When his parents dropped him off at a canine training camp for the summer, they told him it would build discipline. They told him it would make him stronger. But what he found buried inside an old storage room, a letter from his late mother pointing toward a forgotten lighthouse radio station, wasn't just a memory. It was a signal. And that signal would lead him and a retired German Shepherd K9 into a truth his town had tried to bury for 12 years. He thought he was just surviving another lonely summer. He didn't know he was stepping into his mother's unfinished fight. If you've ever felt sent away, if you've ever discovered that what looked like abandonment was actually protection, or if you've ever been handed a story you didn't ask for but knew you had to finish, then this one's for you. Stay with me. And if stories about courage, loyalty, and finding your voice in the static mean something to you, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. Sometimes it's a signal waiting for someone brave enough to answer it. The sky over Blue Ridge, Virginia, was the pale gray of early June heat, heavy with humidity and the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. The Blue Ridge Mountains rolled in soft green waves beyond the gravel road, cicadas buzzing in the trees like a restless electric current. The air smelled of pine sap, warm dust, and kennel disinfectant. That was the morning Ethan Miller was dropped off. Ethan Miller was 14 years old, tall for his age, but still carrying the slight, unfinished frame of someone who had grown too fast and not yet filled out. His dark brown hair fell stubbornly into his eyes no matter how often he brushed it aside. His face was sharp in quiet ways, high cheekbones, thoughtful gray eyes that seemed older than they should have been. He rarely smiled in photographs anymore. He had always been intelligent, too observant, and his teachers said, the kind of boy who noticed what others missed. But since his mother's death 5 years ago, he had turned inward. Words were something he rationed carefully. Silence felt safer. His father, Daniel Miller, stood beside him in the gravel lot outside the main training lodge. Daniel was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, his once athletic build softened by long hours behind a desk. He wore his exhaustion like a permanent shadow under his eyes. Since losing his wife, he had grown practical to the point of severity. Order was how he survived grief. "This will be good for you," Daniel said, adjusting the strap of Ethan's duffel bag. "Structure, discipline, something real." Beside him stood Laura Miller, Ethan's stepmother, tall, thin, with neatly tied blonde hair and a posture that never slouched. She worked as a school administrator and carried that same brisk efficiency into her home life. She wasn't unkind, but she believed in correction more than comfort. "You've been isolated," she added gently, though her tone carried a firmness that suggested this was settled. "Dogs teach responsibility." Ethan said nothing. The cicadas hummed louder. Blue Ridge Canine Academy stood ahead of them, a wide wooden building with a tin roof that flashed silver in the sun. Behind it stretched fenced training fields, agility obstacles, and rows of kennels. The academy was run by Cole Harper. Cole Harper was 52 years old, 6 feet tall, with a lean, wiry build carved by years of physical labor and rescue work. His hair was cropped close, iron gray, and his jaw carried a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. A thin scar ran from the edge of his right eyebrow down toward his temple, a souvenir from a collapsed warehouse rescue 15 years earlier. He moved with quiet authority, every step deliberate. Cole had once been a search and rescue handler for disaster response teams. After losing 2 partners in a wildfire mission in California, and he left federal service and founded Blue Ridge Canine Academy. He believed in preparation, he believed in resilience, and he watched people closely. He studied Ethan now with narrowed blue eyes. 14? Cole asked. Daniel nodded. 14. Cole crouched slightly so his gaze aligned with Ethan's. You ever worked with a dog before? Ethan shook his head. Cole gave a short nod as if confirming something to himself. You will. From the kennel yard, a deep bark echoed. That one's yours, Cole said. Ethan turned. The dog stepping forward through the gate was a German Shepherd large, muscular, with a thick black and tan coat that gleamed under the sun. His name tag read, Ranger. Ranger was 5 years old, in the prime of working age. His ears stood sharply upright, his amber eyes alert but calm. Unlike younger dogs that strained at their leashes, Ranger moved with contained strength, every motion controlled. There was intelligence in his gaze, measured, assessing. A ranger had completed advanced search and rescue certification before being reassigned to training mentorship for younger handlers. He had once located a missing child trapped beneath debris during a flood response. Since then, Cole trusted him with the most difficult pairings. Ethan didn't reach out immediately. Ranger watched him. The silence stretched. Cole unclipped the leash and let the dog approach. Ranger stepped forward, sniffed Ethan's hand, then sat, waiting. It wasn't affection. It was evaluation. "He's the best we've got," Cole said evenly. "Don't waste it." From behind the equipment shed, another boy watched. Noah Brooks was 15, broad-shouldered and already carrying himself like someone older. His sandy blonde hair stuck out under his backward baseball cap. His smile came easily, but so did competition. His father was a local deputy sheriff, and Noah had grown up around patrol dogs. He believed he deserved Ranger. Noah's eyes narrowed slightly. That dog should have been mine," he muttered under his breath. The first week at Blue Ridge was a blur of early mornings and structured drills. Ethan learned commands, learned posture, learned how subtle leash tension translated into communication. Ranger responded not to volume, but to clarity. When Ethan hesitated, Ranger hesitated. When Ethan steadied, Ranger moved. But Ethan felt like a visitor inside his own life. At night, he lay on the narrow bunk in cabin 3, listening to the hum of insects outside the screened window. Other boys whispered and laughed. Noah's voice carried most often. Ethan kept his mother's memory folded inside him like fragile paper. He hadn't spoken about her in years. One afternoon, thick clouds rolled in over the mountains, turning the sky charcoal. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Cole gathered the trainees inside the main lodge. "Storm drills canceled," he announced. "Instead, we clean." Groans followed. And the lodge had an attic storage room above the old recreation hall, a dusty space filled with retired equipment, outdated training manuals, and forgotten boxes. Ethan was assigned to help organize the far corner. He climbed the wooden ladder, Ranger following after Cole gave permission. Dust floated in narrow beams of light filtering through a small circular window. The air smelled of old paper and cedar. Ethan began sorting through a stack of binders labeled Archived K9 Case Files. Ranger wandered to the far wall. Then the old radio crackled. It sat on a shelf near the stairwell, an outdated AM/FM receiver with a dented antenna. Someone downstairs must have turned it on. Static filled the attic. Ranger froze. His ears shot forward. The static shifted briefly into a fragment of music before dissolving again. Ranger let out a low, almost questioning whine. Ethan looked up. "You hear that?" he whispered. Ranger stepped toward the sound, tail rigid, not aggressive, but alert. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He turned back to the box in his hands. Inside was a yellowed manila envelope. His name was written across it in careful cursive. Ethan Miller. His breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakable. His mother's. Sarah Miller had been 32 when she died. She had been small, barely 5'3", with dark auburn hair that curled when it rained. Her eyes were the same gray as Ethan's, but warmer. She had laughed easily. She had volunteered at the local library. She had believed in small communities and second chances. Before her death in a car accident that authorities ruled a wet road collision, she had worked briefly in community media. Ethan remembered sitting in a small booth once, headphones slipping over his ears while she adjusted dials with careful hands. She used to say, "Radio is magic, Ethan. It connects people who can't see each other." His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter folded twice. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, the scent she used to wear. He sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor while Ranger remained beside him, eyes scanning the stairwell. Ethan unfolded the letter. "My sweet Ethan, if you're reading this, then maybe you've found your way back to something important. There's a place in Harbor Point, Maine, where I grew up, a small lighthouse town, and there's a radio station there, WHP 87. We used to call it Lighthouse Radio. It's where people found each other when storms knocked the power out. It's where stories lived. If you ever feel lost, find the signal." Ethan's vision blurred. Harbor Point. He barely remembered visiting once when he was very small. The smell of salt, the sound of waves against rocks. Ranger nudged his arm gently. Downstairs, the radio crackled again. A faint station ID flickered through static before vanishing. Ethan's heart began to pound. Footsteps sounded on the ladder. Noah's head appeared at the top. "What'd you find?" he asked, eyes sharp. Ethan folded the letter quickly. "Nothing," he said. Noah glanced at Ranger, then back at Ethan. "That dog reacts to radio noise," Noah said. "That's weird." Cole's voice echoed from below. "Wrap it up." Ethan slid the envelope into his jacket pocket. The thunder outside broke open the sky. Rain hammered the tin roof. As Ethan climbed down the ladder, the letter pressed against his chest like a pulse. He had come here thinking he'd been sent away, but now, for the first time in 5 years, something felt like a direction. Upstairs, the attic window rattled in the wind, and somewhere in the static a signal waited. The storm passed overnight, leaving Blue Ridge wrapped in a damp silver mist. By morning, the training fields were slick with rain, and the mountains beyond the academy looked closer somehow, as if the world had folded inward. Ethan moved through drills on autopilot. Ranger executed commands with crisp precision, but the dog's attention flicked back to Ethan more often than usual, as though sensing a shift. The letter in Ethan's pocket felt heavier than it had the night before, like it carried not just ink and paper, but momentum. After breakfast, Ethan slipped behind the maintenance shed, away from the other trainees. Ranger trotted at his heel, ears pricked. Ethan unfolded the letter again, reading the lines more slowly this time. His mother's handwriting curved gently across the page, steady and certain. She wrote about Harbor Point, Maine, a coastal town where fog rolled in like a living thing and where the lighthouse beam cut through storms for generations. She described WHP 87 Lighthouse Radio as more than a station. It had been a community lifeline. She had volunteered there in her early 20s, answering calls during nor'easters, reading school closings, organizing fundraisers for fishermen whose boats had been damaged. "Radio is how we stayed connected when the roads washed out," she wrote. "It's how we found each other." Ethan had known she loved stories, but he hadn't known she'd loved that place so fiercely. The next paragraph tightened his throat. 12 years ago, the station had closed after a late-night fire that investigators called an electrical accident. His mother had been there earlier that evening. She left before the flames started. The building had survived structurally, but the damage inside forced it to shut down permanently. "They said it was faulty wiring," she wrote. "Maybe it was, but sometimes the truth gets buried when it's inconvenient." Ethan stared at that sentence longer than the others. Ranger shifted closer as Ethan whispered the words, "Lighthouse Radio." The dog's posture changed instantly. His muscles tightened. His gaze sharpened toward the main lodge where faint static from the old radio drifted out an open window. It wasn't fear in Ranger's body. It was recognition. Ethan crouched and pressed his forehead lightly against the dog's temple. "You hear it too, don't you?" Ranger's tail gave a single, deliberate sweep. Noah Brooks had been watching again. He stood near the fence line, pretending to adjust a training cone. Noah's competitive swagger had softened since the storm. Up close, there was something restless about him, an eagerness that masked insecurity. His father's expectations weighed on him more than he let on. When Noah approached, his expression was sharp but curious. "Yeah, you're acting weird," he said quietly. "You weren't like this yesterday." Ethan folded the letter without answering. Noah's eyes flicked to the paper. "Is that from home?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. "It's older than that." Later that afternoon, Ethan sought out Cole Harper near the kennel rows. Cole stood with a clipboard, inspecting latch mechanisms. He moved methodically, checking each hinge with a firm tug. "Sir," Ethan began, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. "Have you ever heard of Harbor Point, Maine?" Cole paused, just briefly. It was the smallest hesitation, but Ethan caught it. Cole's gaze shifted from the latch to Ethan's face. "Small town," he said. "Why?" Ethan shrugged. "Just something I read." Cole studied him longer than necessary. The scar near his temple seemed more pronounced in the hard light. "Places like that remember everything," Cole said finally, "even when they pretend not to." That evening, while the other boys played cards in cabin 3, Ethan sat on his bunk and unfolded a printed map he'd pulled from the common computer. Harbor Point lay nearly 12 hours north by bus, farther if routes were delayed. The idea felt reckless, but the letter's final line pulsed in his mind. "If you ever feel lost, find the signal." He had been lost for years. Maybe he hadn't known it. Ranger lay at his feet, chin resting on crossed paws. When Ethan murmured "lighthouse," the dog's ears flicked up again. The reaction was consistent now. It wasn't coincidence. Ethan remembered Cole mentioning Ranger's early search and rescue deployments had included coastal missions after hurricanes. Could Ranger have worked near Harbor Point? Could that static in the attic have been more than interference? Noah appeared in the doorway, arms folded. "You're not sleeping," he observed. Ethan didn't deny it. Noah stepped inside, lowering his voice. "If you're planning something, you're not good at hiding it." Ethan met his eyes. For a moment, he considered lying. Instead, he said nothing. Silence had always been his shield. But Noah surprised him. "I won't tell," he said. "Not yet." There was something almost respectful in the admission. "I just want to know why you got Ranger." It wasn't jealousy now. It was vulnerability. The next morning, Ethan made the decision. He packed lightly water bottle, a flashlight from the supply closet, the letter, and a small amount of saved allowance money. He clipped Ranger's lead quietly just before dawn. The sky was pale blue, the mist lifting in thin ribbons. Ranger stood alert but calm, as if this departure were an assignment rather than a rebellion. They slipped past the outer fence through a maintenance gate that hadn't latched fully since the storm. Ethan's heart pounded with every step down the gravel road. He expected someone to shout. No one did. Behind them, Noah watched from the cabin window. He hesitated only a second before pulling on his boots and grabbing his phone. Yet he didn't run after Ethan immediately. Instead, he trailed at a distance, curiosity overtaking caution. He wanted to see where this went. Cole discovered Ranger's empty kennel at morning inspection. He stood very still for a long time. He did not call the sheriff. Instead, he walked to his office, shut the door, and opened a drawer Ethan had never seen him use. Inside was an old photograph of a coastal lighthouse and a younger Cole beside a radio tower. The past flickered behind his eyes. He picked up his truck keys but did not start the engine. Not yet. On the road leading out of Blue Ridge, Ethan paused beneath a stand of tall pines. Ranger's ears tilted toward the distant hum of traffic from the highway. Ethan felt the weight of what he was doing settle fully onto his shoulders. This wasn't just skipping camp. It was stepping into something unknown. "We're going to Harbor Point," he whispered. Ranger's tail lifted, not wagging wildly but steady, ready. As they reached the bus stop 2 miles down the road, the early commuter line was just pulling in. The driver, a middle-aged woman with sun-lined skin and kind brown eyes, gave Ethan a questioning look but said nothing when he paid cash. Ranger settled at Ethan's feet as the bus doors hissed shut. Blue Ridge disappeared behind trees and rising heat haze. Ethan held the letter against his chest and stared out the window at the long stretch of highway ahead. He didn't know what waited in Harbor Point. He only knew that staying felt like suffocating. Moving felt like breathing. Behind him, several rows back, Noah slipped into a seat unnoticed. He kept his hood up and his distance, curiosity now fully committed. And far back at the academy, Cole stood alone in the gravel lot, watching the empty road with an expression that mixed worry with something else, something like recognition. He didn't reach for his phone. He let the silence stretch. "Find your signal," he murmured under his breath, as if he'd heard those words before. The bus carried Ethan and Ranger north, toward a lighthouse town wrapped in memory and unanswered questions. The bus rolled into Harbor Point just after dusk, brakes sighing as fog drifted low across the narrow streets. The town was smaller than Ethan imagined, pressed between dark pine-covered hills and a restless Atlantic shoreline. Salt hung heavy in the air. Weathered clapboard buildings lined Main Street, paint peeling in quiet surrender to the sea. At the edge of town, the lighthouse stood tall against the deepening blue sky, its white tower streaked with age but unbowed. Beside it, barely visible through overgrown grass and rusted fencing, stood a squat brick building with a faded sign, WHP 87. Ethan stepped off the bus with Ranger close at his side. The German shepherd's paws touched asphalt and his posture changed instantly. His nose lifted to the wind, sampling scents invisible to Ethan. The ocean breeze carried brine, a diesel from fishing boats, and something older charred wood and damp stone. Several rows back, Noah Brooks remained seated until the bus pulled away. Then he stepped down too, hood still pulled over his blonde hair. He kept his distance, phone already in his hand. Noah had activated a private location live stream to a trusted contact back at camp, a quiet IT-savvy trainee named Mason Turner, a lanky 16-year-old with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of tapping his fingers when thinking. Mason was not physically present, but he tracked Ethan's route via shared GPS pin, offering occasional text guidance about bus transfers and road layouts. Noah didn't announce this help. He simply wanted to make sure Ethan didn't vanish. Harbor Point felt suspended in time. Fishing boats rocked in the harbor, their masts clinking against metal rings. A woman in her late 60s stepped out of a corner diner as Ethan passed. She had silver hair pulled into a tight bun and wore a faded navy cardigan. At her name tag read Margaret. Her face was lined but observant, eyes sharp despite her age. She gave Ethan and Ranger a long look but said nothing. In towns like this, strangers were cataloged silently. The lighthouse beam rotated slowly as night deepened. Ethan followed the gravel path toward it. The station sat beside the lighthouse compound, separated by a rusted chain-link fence. The WHP 87 sign was barely legible, letters cracked from years of salt air. Ranger stopped before the entrance gate. His ears stood rigid, tail steady but elevated, not fear recognition. "You've been here before," Ethan murmured. The gate creaked when pushed. The station's exterior showed signs of fire damage, long ago blackened patches along the roofline, replaced shingles slightly mismatched. Windows were boarded but not reinforced heavily. It didn't look condemned, it looked forgotten. Ethan found a loose board at the rear service entrance. Ranger slipped through first. Inside, a dust lay thick across the concrete floor. The air was stale but not suffocating. Moonlight filtered through cracks and boarded windows, casting pale lines across equipment. The main studio opened ahead, a wide room with an old broadcast console still anchored to the center desk. Knobs were dulled with age but intact. Microphone stands remained upright. The transmitter racks against the wall showed no sign of being stripped. Wiring hung loose in places, but the core system had not been gutted. "They didn't salvage it," Ethan whispered. "They just left." Ranger padded slowly around the room, nose brushing the baseboards. He paused near a collapsed ceiling tile and gave a short, sharp bark. Ethan knelt and pushed aside debris. Beneath it was a metal trapdoor, small, square, nearly flush with the floor. The latch was stiff but functional. When Ethan pulled, it opened to reveal a narrow concrete stairwell descending into darkness. The smell below was different, cooler, dry. Ranger descended first, moving carefully but without hesitation. Ethan followed, flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. The basement was no more than a storage cellar, but shelves lined one wall. On them sat boxes, water-stained but sealed. Ranger moved to the far corner and scratched once at a wooden crate. Inside the crate were file folders wrapped in plastic and a small lockbox. Ethan lifted one folder. It bore his mother's handwriting on the tab, Community Land Records. He swallowed hard. Back upstairs, Ethan located a small side office off the studio. The desk inside still held scattered papers fused slightly at the edges from heat exposure years earlier. On the far shelf sat a cardboard box labeled Cassette Archives. Ethan opened it. Inside were dozens of labeled tapes. One caught his eye. Community Voices. Sarah M. His hands shook. He inserted the cassette into an old portable player still sitting on the desk. Miraculously, batteries left inside had corroded, but the machine's compartment was clean enough for new ones. From his bag, Ethan produced spare AA batteries he'd brought for the flashlight. Static crackled. Then a familiar voice filled the room, softer, younger than he remembered, but unmistakable. "Good evening, Harbor Point. This is Sarah Miller on Lighthouse Radio." Ethan sat down slowly. In the recording, his mother spoke about fundraising for dock repairs after a winter storm. Her tone was warm but firm, steady in crisis. She interviewed local fishermen, asking about water conditions. Later segments shifted tone. She referenced a proposed development project, Seaview Coastal Holdings, that aimed to purchase shoreline properties for a luxury marina expansion. She questioned whether residents were being pressured into sales. "Transparency protects communities," she said in one broadcast. Ethan leaned back, pulse pounding. On another tape, the tone sharpened. "Several families report being offered below market value for generational homes. When they refuse, inspections suddenly appear. Permits are delayed. We deserve answers." The official record had said the fire was electrical. But here, days before the blaze, his mother sounded cautious, concerned. Ranger let out a low rumble as if responding to the rising tension in the voice. Above ground, Noah crouched near a broken window, phone camera angled discreetly toward the lighthouse and station exterior. He texted Mason. Inside. Station still intact. Something's here. Mason responded with a satellite image of Harbor Point's property lines. Seaview Coastal Holdings appeared highlighted in recent land acquisitions around the lighthouse perimeter. Noah's jaw tightened. This wasn't random curiosity anymore. Back at Blue Ridge, Cole Harper sat at his desk with an old contact book open. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. After 3 rings, a gravelly voice answered. Yeah? Tom, it's Cole Harper. A pause. Well, I'll be damned. Thought you retired inland. Thomas Tom Whitaker had once been the chief broadcast engineer at WHP 87. Now 70, he lived alone above a bait-and-tackle shop 2 blocks from Harbor Point's dock. He was thin as driftwood, with white hair and nicotine-stained fingers. Years of soldering circuit boards had left faint burns across his knuckles. After the fire 12 years ago, Tom had testified that the electrical panel showed signs inconsistent with accidental overload, but his statement was dismissed when investigators ruled otherwise. Since then, he kept to himself. I need to know something, Cole said quietly. If someone went back to the station now, would anything still be there? Tom exhaled slowly. Depends what they're looking for. Inside the station basement, Ethan opened the lockbox with difficulty. The hinge was rusted but not sealed. Inside were USB drives and printed contracts. The documents referenced land transfers tied to Seaview Coastal Holdings. Several signatures looked identical in pen pressure and angle. Forged? Ethan wasn't sure, but one line stood out. Conditional development approval pending community compliance. Ethan's chest tightened. He climbed back upstairs and looked around the studio with new eyes. This wasn't just nostalgia. This had been resistance. Ranger returned to his side, pressing lightly against his leg. The dog's steady presence anchored him. Outside, the lighthouse beam rotated again, casting white light through cracked studio glass. Ethan stood in its glow, letter in hand, tapes beside him. He had come searching for memory. He had found evidence. And as fog rolled in thicker from the Atlantic, Harbor Point seemed to hold its breath. The fog lingered into morning, thinning only when the sun pushed pale gold through the clouds. Inside WHP 87, dust motes floated in angled light from the boarded windows. Ethan hadn't slept. He sat cross-legged on the studio floor, cassette player balanced in his hands. Ranger lay beside him, alert despite the long night, his amber eyes tracking every subtle shift in sound. Ethan reached into the archive box and found the tape labeled in his mother's handwriting. Final segment. Personal. The ink looked slightly smudged, as if written in haste. His fingers trembled before pressing play. Static crackled, then her voice emerged clearer than before, but tighter. Not frightened. Determined. "This may be the most important broadcast I ever make," Sarah Miller said. Ethan closed his eyes. His mother's voice carried strength even when uncertainty hovered beneath it. She had always been small in stature but unyielding in presence. At 5'3", with auburn curls and expressive gray eyes, she commanded rooms not by volume but by conviction. She believed deeply in fairness. It had shaped her work at the station. It had shaped her life. In the recording, she explained that Seaview Coastal Holdings had been acquiring shoreline properties through falsified appraisals and coercive contracts. Elderly homeowners were pressured to sign documents under threat of zoning violations. Some signatures on deeds were inconsistent with verified samples. "We obtained independent handwriting analysis," she said. "Several of these contracts appear altered." Ethan's pulse hammered. Sarah continued. "We intend to present this documentation to the county board and the state attorney general's office tomorrow morning. Harbor Point deserves transparency." The recording paused briefly. It then resumed with a softer tone. "If this broadcast doesn't air, I need you to know, truth doesn't vanish just because someone tries to silence it." The tape cut off abruptly, not with a fade, with a click. Ethan sat frozen. That night 12 years ago, the fire had consumed part of the building. Ranger stood suddenly and moved toward the north wall of the studio, where bricks bore darker scorch marks than others. He sniffed intensely along the base, then pawed once, twice, precisely at the seam where 2 bricks met unevenly. Ethan rose and followed. The bricks looked slightly misaligned, newer mortar applied carelessly. He pressed against them. One shifted inward slightly. Using a metal crowbar he'd found in the basement tool shelf, Ethan pried carefully. 2 bricks loosened, revealing a cavity within the wall. Inside was a compact fireproof safe, matte black, edges charred but intact. Ethan's breath caught. He dragged it free. The keypad was melted beyond function, but the hinge seemed intact. He struck the seam gently with the crowbar. After several strikes, the latch gave way. Inside were 3 USB drives and a thick envelope containing copies of signed contracts, notarized statements from residents, and internal memos stamped with Seaview's corporate letterhead. One document bore the signature of Gregory Halden, CEO of Seaview Coastal Holdings, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s known for his polished public persona and aggressive development strategy. Halden had grown up in Boston, worked corporate real estate in Manhattan, and built his reputation by acquiring distressed coastal towns and transforming them into luxury marinas. He was charismatic in interviews but ruthless in negotiations. Several lawsuits had followed his projects, most settled quietly. Ethan felt a rush of heat behind his eyes. This wasn't speculation anymore. Upstairs near the lighthouse path, Noah crouched behind a stack of lobster traps. His phone buzzed. A message from Mason. Local property filings confirm rapid acquisitions 12 years ago. Pattern matches coercion. Noah swallowed. He had never intended to get involved in something like this. He just hadn't wanted Ethan alone. A truck engine rumbled on the gravel road. Noah froze. A Harbor Point patrol cruiser rolled into view. The officer who stepped out was Sheriff Daniel Rourke, a man in his early 40s with sun-reddened skin and a neatly trimmed beard. He moved with practiced caution, scanning the station exterior. Rourke had served in the Marine Corps before returning to Harbor Point to take over the small department from his retiring father. He valued order. He valued reputation. Harbor Point survived on tourism and quiet stability. Reopening old wounds was not something he welcomed. Noah stepped forward reluctantly. "Sir," he said, voice tight. Rourke's eyes narrowed. "You from around here?" "No," Noah admitted. Rourke's gaze shifted toward the building. "You alone?" Noah hesitated. Inside the station, Ethan heard the cruiser door slam. Ranger's ears snapped upright. A low warning growl vibrated in his chest. Not aggression, but alertness. Ethan climbed the basement steps quickly, USB drives clutched in his hand. Rourke entered the studio doorway just as Ethan emerged. The sheriff's eyes took in the crowbar, the open wall cavity, the safe. "What exactly are you doing here?" Rourke asked, tone measured but firm. Ethan straightened. "This station belonged to my mother." Rourke's expression shifted slightly. "Sarah Miller?" Ethan nodded. A flicker of recognition crossed Rourke's face. She was persistent. "She was right," Ethan replied, holding up the envelope. Rourke stepped closer, glancing at the documents without fully reading them. "The fire was ruled accidental," he said carefully. "Electrical fault." "Did you see the report yourself?" Ethan asked. Rourke's jaw tightened. I was in high school when it happened." Outside, a second vehicle pulled up, a faded blue pickup truck. An older man stepped out slowly, leaning on a cane. Thomas Whitaker moved with visible stiffness, but his eyes were sharp beneath thick brows. He wore a weathered flannel shirt and carried a small tool bag over his shoulder. Rourke glanced at him. "Tom?" "Sheriff?" Tom nodded, voice gravelly. He looked past Rourke to Ethan. "You must be her boy." Ethan's throat tightened. Tom entered the studio, gaze sweeping the equipment. "She told me she'd hidden copies," he murmured. Rourke folded his arms. "Hidden what exactly?" Tom set his bag down and crouched near the exposed wall cavity. "The fire didn't start from faulty wiring," he said quietly. "I checked the panel myself that night. Burn patterns were external, accelerant." Rourke's posture stiffened. "That's not what the state investigator concluded." Tom met his eyes steadily. "The investigator stayed 3 hours. I stayed 3 days. Silence thickened. Back at Blue Ridge Academy, Cole Harper stood at the edge of the training field, phone pressed to his ear. Noah's earlier live location feed had tipped him off to Harbor Point. He now spoke directly to Sheriff Rourke, whose number he still had from regional search coordination days. "You need to hear the kid out," Cole said evenly. "I was on volunteer standby the night of that fire. I remember the smell. It wasn't wiring." On the other end, Rourke exhaled slowly. Inside the studio, Ranger positioned himself beside Ethan, steady and unwavering. Rourke studied the USB drives now resting on the console. "Even if these documents are legitimate," he said carefully, "you can't just break into a property and accuse a corporation of arson based on suspicion." "It's not suspicion," Ethan replied. "It's evidence. Tom reached into his tool bag and produced a portable laptop, older but functional. He inserted one of the USB drives. Files loaded slowly. Mine contracts, scanned appraisals, internal memos referencing community pressure strategy. Rourke's face hardened. These weren't in the official case file, Tom said. Because they were never submitted, Ethan said quietly. She planned to. The sheriff stepped back, conflict visible across his features. Harbor Point's image mattered. So did truth. I'll review everything formally, Rourke said finally. But until then, this station remains closed. Ethan nodded slowly. Ranger relaxed slightly, sensing the shift in tension. Outside, fog lifted enough to reveal the full lighthouse tower in daylight. Its beam was inactive now, but it stood resolute against the Atlantic wind. Inside WHP 87, the truth no longer felt buried. It felt uncovered. By late afternoon, word had spread quietly across Harbor Point. Not through official channels, not yet, but through glances exchanged at the docks, through murmurs inside Margaret's diner, through Sheriff Rourke's unusually tense posture as he stepped out of the station earlier than usual. Something had shifted. Inside WHP 87, the air no longer felt abandoned. It felt expectant. Cole Harper arrived just before sunset in his weathered forest green pickup truck. He stepped out slowly, scanning the station exterior before locking eyes with Ethan. The mountain sharpness that defined Cole's expression softened slightly when he saw the boy standing steady beside Ranger. "You made it farther than I expected," Cole said quietly. It wasn't reprimand. It was acknowledgement. Cole moved with purpose inside the studio. He removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and assessed the transmitter racks. Years of search and rescue logistics had given him an instinct for broken systems. He understood power lines, backup generators, makeshift communication setups. "We don't need full restoration," he muttered. "Just enough for one clean broadcast." Thomas Whitaker shuffled in behind him, carrying additional cables and a compact voltage meter. Tom's hands trembled slightly from age, but steadied when touching machinery. "Transmitter's old analog," he said, adjusting his glasses. "But these beasts were built to survive storms." He crouched by the panel, testing circuits. "We can bypass the main breaker if we feed temporary current from a portable generator." Sheriff Rourke stood near the doorway, arms folded, watching. His earlier skepticism had thinned into wary contemplation. He had contacted the county office after reviewing preliminary documents. The response had been cautious, but interested. He wasn't prepared to endorse the broadcast, but he didn't stop it. As twilight settled, a small generator hummed behind the building. Cables ran through a cracked window to the transmitter rack. Tom adjusted dials carefully while Cole monitored voltage levels. Ranger remained seated near the entrance, gaze fixed outward, as if guarding not just the room, but the moment. Noah lingered near the far wall, hands in his pockets. His earlier bravado had dissolved entirely. He stepped forward slowly. "I shouldn't have followed you," he said, voice low but clear. Ethan looked at him. Noah continued. "I thought you were just trying to show off. I was wrong." It was the first time he had spoken without defensiveness. Ethan nodded once. Forgiveness did not require words. The control board flickered. Small amber lights blinked alive across the console. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Frequencies still aligned to 87.5, he said. "Signal range might be limited, but it'll reach town." Ethan sat down in the worn vinyl chair behind the microphone, the same microphone his mother had once used. His hands trembled, but his voice did not when he tested it. "Audio check." His words echoed faintly in the monitor speaker. Cole placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "One night," he said quietly. "Make it count." Outside, Harbor Point moved through its ordinary evening routines. Fishing crews unloaded late catches. Families gathered around dinner tables. Margaret wiped down the diner counter before reaching up to adjust the small AM/FM radio perched near the coffee machine. Static crackled briefly, then, "Good evening, Harbor Point." Margaret froze. The voice was younger, unfamiliar, but the call sign that followed was unmistakable. "This is WHP 87 Lighthouse Radio." Forks paused midair across town. Televisions were muted. Car radios were adjusted upward in volume. Inside the studio, Ethan inhaled slowly. 12 years ago. This station went silent after a fire ruled accidental. Tonight, we're here to finish a broadcast that never aired. Cole stepped back, allowing the moment to belong entirely to Ethan. Ethan unfolded the final transcript from his mother's recording. His voice remained steady as he read her words, the investigation into falsified deeds, the pattern of coercion, the planned presentation of evidence. He described the documents recovered from the concealed safe. He referenced the USB files and notarized contracts now in Sheriff Rourke's possession. Across town, people stepped outside onto porches, radios clutched in hand. Some walked toward the lighthouse, drawn by memory. Tom adjusted the transmitter slightly to maintain signal clarity. "She'd be proud," he muttered under his breath. Ethan concluded with his mother's final recorded sentence. "Truth doesn't vanish just because someone tries to silence it." Silence followed for 2 full seconds. Yet then the phone line inside the station rang. Tom stared at it in disbelief. "Landline still connected?" Cole picked it up cautiously. "WHP 87, P." A voice crackled through. "This is Channel 6 News out of Portland. We're receiving reports of an unauthorized broadcast regarding Seaview Coastal Holdings. Is this legitimate?" Cole glanced at Ethan, then handed him the receiver. Within minutes, local news vans began appearing on the coastal road. Camera crews stepped out, adjusting equipment under the lighthouse beam. Reporters, young, sharp-eyed, carrying notepads, approached cautiously. One introduced herself as Claire Benson, a state investigative correspondent in her early 30s, with dark-cropped hair and a reputation for exposing corporate fraud. Her posture was direct but respectful. "We've reviewed similar acquisition patterns across 3 coastal towns," she said quietly. "If your documents confirm forgery..." This becomes a state-level investigation." Sheriff Rourke stood firm at the edge of the growing crowd. "Evidence is under review," he told reporters. "No conclusions until verified." But the town had already drawn its own. By full nightfall, more than half of Harbor Point had gathered outside the station. Fishermen stood shoulder to shoulder with shop owners. Elderly couples who remembered the original broadcasts wiped quiet tears. The lighthouse beam cut across their faces in slow arcs of white light. Inside, Ranger moved to the doorway and sat tall. Children approached cautiously, whispering his name. Someone reached out tentatively to pet him. Ranger remained calm, accepting the touch without distraction. Word spread quickly. The dog had found the hidden safe. "Hero dog," a boy murmured. Ranger's ears flicked, but he stayed composed. Noah stepped forward in front of several trainees who had arrived in Cole's truck. "He found it," Noah said openly, nodding toward Ranger and then toward Ethan. He didn't give up. There was no envy in his voice now, only respect. Cole addressed the gathering briefly. "I was present the night of that fire 12 years ago," he said. "I volunteered on the emergency perimeter. The burn patterns didn't match a wiring fault. I should have spoken louder then." His jaw tightened. "I won't stay quiet now." Claire Benson scribbled rapidly in her notebook. Within hours, Seaview Coastal Holdings released a brief public statement denying all allegations. By morning, state investigators had requested formal access to corporate land records. Gregory Halden's office declined further comment. But Harbor Point had heard the signal. As the generator sputtered and the final song, an old coastal folk tune from the archived tapes, played through the transmitter, Ethan leaned back from the microphone. The red on-air light dimmed. Outside, applause rose, not thunderous but steady, collective. Ethan stepped out of the station. The crowd parted slightly as he passed. Margaret from the diner reached out and squeezed his hand. "Your mother would have stood just like that," she said softly. Ethan glanced at Ranger, who stood beside him, illuminated briefly by the rotating lighthouse beam. For one night, the station had lived again. The signal had returned. By the time August arrived, Harbor Point no longer felt like a town holding its breath. It felt like one exhaling after years underwater. The state investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Claire Benson's reports spread beyond Maine, picked up by larger networks. Handwriting analysts confirmed irregularities in property deeds. Financial auditors traced shell transfers linked to Seaview Coastal Holdings. Internal emails recovered from the USB drives Ethan had found revealed explicit strategies labeled expedited compliance acquisition. Under mounting evidence, Gregory Halden resigned as CEO pending federal inquiry. Within weeks, Seaview's proposed marina expansion was officially suspended, then permanently revoked. And Sheriff Daniel Rourke stood before the town council one humid evening and delivered the findings with steady composure. His voice carried the weight of accountability. The original fire investigation was incomplete, he admitted publicly. New evidence indicates accelerant presence inconsistent with accidental electrical fault. He did not look away from the crowd when he said it. For Harbor Point, the revelation wasn't simply about corporate corruption. It was about validation, about knowing that Sarah Miller hadn't imagined the danger she sensed. Margaret from the diner closed early that night and joined a group gathered outside the lighthouse. She had known Sarah well, had once shared coffee at the same counter where the old radio sat humming. She was stubborn, Margaret told anyone who would listen. In the best way. Inside WHP 87, the station felt different now. Not abandoned, not haunted, alive. Town volunteers scrubbed soot from walls and repainted trim. Retired fishermen repaired broken fencing. High school students cleaned debris from the basement. And Thomas Whitaker supervised wiring repairs with the seriousness of a man restoring more than equipment. His thin frame moved slowly, but his hands regained confidence when holding tools. "She always said this place wasn't about profit," he murmured to Ethan one afternoon. "It was about voice." The town council called a special meeting in the old municipal hall, a red brick building facing the harbor. Ethan sat in the front row beside Cole and Ranger. Ranger's coat had been brushed until it gleamed, and a temporary blue ribbon hung from his collar. Children pointed and smiled at him as they passed. Council Chairwoman Evelyn Harper, no relation to Cole, stood at the podium. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut in a clean bob and a posture that suggested decades of responsibility. Her voice was firm but warm. "Ethan Miller," she began. Your courage restored something we lost." She motioned toward a stack of documents on the table. "The deed to WHP 87 is legally transferable. Given your mother's legacy and your discovery, the council believes the station rightfully belongs to you." The room filled with quiet applause. Ethan felt heat rise to his face. He glanced at Ranger, then at Cole. Cole's expression held no instruction, only support. Ethan stood. His voice, when it came, carried the steadiness he had found behind that microphone weeks earlier. "My mom didn't fight for ownership," he said. "She fought for the town." He paused, looking out at fishermen, teachers, shop owners. "If this station belongs to anyone, it belongs to Harbor Point." A murmur rippled through the room. "I don't want it as property," Ethan continued. "I want it as community." Silence settled, followed by applause louder than before. Not dramatic, grateful. Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then we'll establish it as Harbor Point Community Radio," she declared. "Managed by a volunteer board." Thomas Whitaker wiped his eyes discreetly. Outside, the lighthouse beam rotated across the darkening sky. The following week marked the first official broadcast under its new name. Volunteers crowded inside the studio. Margaret brought homemade blueberry pie. Sheriff Rourke stood in the back with arms folded, no longer skeptical but protective. Ethan did not take the microphone that night. Instead, he watched as a local high school senior named Leah Monroe, 17, tall with curly brown hair and a nervous smile, stepped into the booth. Leah had grown up listening to archived recordings of Sarah's voice. She hoped to study journalism one day. Tonight, her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the headset. "Good evening, Harbor Point," Leah began. "You're listening to Harbor Point Community Radio." The room fell still. When she introduced the first segment, an interview with fishermen about sustainable practices, Ethan felt something settle inside him. The station didn't need him to survive. It needed space. Ranger sat beside him, head resting against Ethan's knee. Summer, however, was ending. Blue Ridge K-9 Academy awaited their return. Cole had remained in Harbor Point longer than expected, assisting with statements and ensuring evidence chains remained intact. But he was a man of structure, of commitments. The morning Ethan prepared to leave, Harbor Point gathered once more near the lighthouse. Margaret pressed a wrapped slice of pie into his hands for the road. Sheriff Rourke shook his hand firmly. "You did more than most adults would," he said. Thomas Whitaker handed Ethan a small, polished brass microphone pinned the old WHP 87 logo. "For when you forget how brave you were," he said. Ethan clipped it carefully to his backpack strap. As the bus pulled away from Harbor Point, Ranger remained upright, in watching until the lighthouse disappeared into fog. Back at Blue Ridge, the cicadas still buzzed in late August heat. The academy fields were golden from summer sun. Noah stood near the gate when Ethan stepped off the bus. He didn't speak at first, just offered a nod that carried respect. Mason Turner lingered behind him, shy but smiling faintly. "Signal reached pretty far," Mason said softly. Even here. Cole resumed training schedules without ceremony. But something subtle had shifted. Ethan moved through drills differently now, decisive, grounded. Ranger responded with heightened precision. At the final evaluation session of the summer, Cole gathered the trainees under the shade of a large oak tree. Certificates were handed out one by one. When Ranger's name was called, Cole's voice deepened slightly. Ranger has demonstrated advanced search and community response capability, he said. Effective immediately, he is reinstated as an active rescue canine for regional deployment. Applause followed. Ranger stood tall, tail steady. His amber eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan before returning forward. Later that evening, the Academy common room radio crackled softly. Someone had tuned it to 87.5 out of habit. Static shifted. Then, Harbor Point Community Radio broadcasting live. The signal carried faint but clear across state lines under the right atmospheric conditions. Ethan leaned back in his chair, listening as Leah's voice introduced a segment about coastal preservation grants. He closed his eyes. His mother had not left him a building. She had left him a direction. A voice does not belong to one person. It belongs to those willing to carry it forward. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's leg once more, steady and certain. Outside, summer softened into early autumn. The season ended not with silence, but with signal. Every story leaves something behind. Not always money, not always buildings. Sometimes it leaves a voice. Ethan thought he had been sent away for discipline. He thought that summer was about obedience, structure, and training a dog. But what he really learned was this. When truth calls you, you answer. Even if you are young, even if you are scared, even if you feel alone. In everyday life, most of us will never uncover a hidden safe in a burned radio station. But we all face smaller versions of that moment. A time when something feels wrong and we have to decide whether to stay silent or speak. A time when we can walk away for comfort or step forward for courage. A time when we realize that what was left to us is not a burden, but a responsibility. Maybe your inheritance is not property. Maybe it is integrity. Maybe it is faith. Yes, maybe it is the quiet strength your parents showed you when no one else was watching. Ethan learned that his mother did not leave him a building. She left him a signal. And he discovered that the strongest signals are not broadcast through towers. They are carried in character, loyalty, and truth. In your daily life, you may not stand behind a microphone, but you speak through your choices, through how you treat people, through whether you show up when it matters, through whether you protect the vulnerable, through whether you finish what others were too afraid to complete. And sometimes God places you exactly where you need to be, even when it feels like you were sent away. What feels like punishment can become purpose. What feels like isolation can become preparation. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment and tell me what signal you are choosing to follow in your own life. I read them. Your story matters here. And if you believe that courage, truth, and faith still matter in this world, subscribe to the channel and be part of this community. We are building something steady together. May God bless you and protect you. May He give you the strength to speak when it is hard and the peace to trust when the path is unclear. If you believe that God is guiding your steps and that truth always finds its way to the surface, type Amen in the comments. You are not alone.